Hello, welcome back to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. I'm here in the studio with my friends and colleagues,
David Kennedy
and Red Keating,
and I'm Julie Brown. And once again, we are here with a guest we're going to share this next hour or so with, an author, journalist, Patricia Pearson. Thrilled to have you with us today and talk about the book that we've read, but your other writing and journalistic endeavors as well. So, Patricia, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm going to read your official bio and then we'll jump into some conversation. So, Patricia Pearson is an author, a journalist, and a professionally certified integral coach, working with clients to deepen their understanding of what drives them, to reframe narratives around grief, and to find voice and clarity in writing. Her books include Opening Heaven's Door, What the Dying May Be Trying to Teach Us, and Wish You Were Here, A Sister's Murder, A Brother's Quest, and a Hunt for a Serial Killer. She directed the research for a History Channel documentary, The Science of the Soul, her TEDx talk at the University of Arizona, Why Ghosts Are Good for You, points to research showing how important experiences with unexplained phenomena can be in helping people cope with their grief. Most recently, she contributed a chapter to the anthology Interacting with the Divine, the Sacred and the Deceased, Theological and Psychological Perspectives. She has a BA in History from the University of Toronto and a Master's in Science in Journalism from Columbia University. She is also the co-founder of Bellwoods Press, which offers clients the chance to tell their stories to a sensitive journalist and publish a book for their extended family and social network. So much in there, so much we could talk about. We'll try to get to little bits of it today. Welcome, Patricia.
Thank you very much.
And it is a real honor and a privilege for us to have you here. I remember the first time I heard you was actually in a radio interview conversation. And I can't remember if it was Sheila Rogers or who that was on a Sunday afternoon. I was driving home from Toronto. It was just after your book had been published. And she was having conversation with you about the book. And I was just enamored with that. And I loved the interview. And I thought, I got to get that book. And I came home immediately and I bought the book and read it and bought 2 other copies for our hospice library, actually. So you captured my imagination right from the beginning, and I appreciate it so much. So it's an honor to have you here today, Patricia.
Thank you.
In the book, which really, it seems to me, flows out of a personal experience. I mean, that's what kind of was the catalyst to produce all this, and very, very personal for you. And I'm wondering if perhaps that's a good place to start. You could share with us what that was that kind of led you into this direction and this incredible research then that has captured your life work for a long time.
Yeah, I think this is actually the case for a lot of journalists and scientists who wind up doing any kind of research in this area, is that they have to be galvanized by a personal experience that they want to understand, because otherwise they're holding themselves accountable to a kind of materialistic, scientific narrative about the biology of humans and the fact that when we die, and that's it. And so similarly in my case, it wasn't like a background specialty that I had as a journalist at all. But what happened was in 2008, my sister was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer, and it had spread to her brain. And my father, who was, as far as we knew, fairly healthy, although he had his favorite Bailey's Irish cream every night and lots of chocolate. But, generally speaking, he was fine. He was 80. But he'd heard the news about my sister. And he died in the middle of the night, just silently in the bed beside my mother. And my sister at the time happened to be awake in her house in Montreal. And of course, she was very much awake often during this period because she was so scared about what was going to happen to her and therefore what was going to happen to her 2 teenage sons and everything that goes through the mind of somebody who's facing a terminal illness. So she was in that kind of state, and all of a sudden she felt a sense of a presence in her bedroom. And then she felt the tangible feeling of hands kind of gently cupping the back of her head. And she was infused. It's hard to explain because she, if you haven't had this experience, it was even hard for her to explain, but she was filled inexplicably with this sense of peacefulness and comfort, as if everything was going to be all right. Almost as if she'd taken an oxy or something, like, just an immediate transformation of her mood. And she was so struck by this experience that she wrote about it in her diary first thing in the morning, and she emailed my nephew to tell him as well. And then after that, she found out that my father had died. And so her immediate intuitive interpretation was that Dad had died and come to her, on his way to reassure her and to say, I will be there for you and you're going to be okay. And she held to that belief for the next 9 weeks until she herself died.
Wow. And I think all of us and the three of us could certainly share multitudes of stories that mirror that reality of experiencing that's real. And I think those are the things that I believe this is an important conversation to have, because as you mention in your book so often, people who experience these are far more than we realize, and yet the opportunity or the opportunity and willingness to share them without being put down really keeps a lot of that in kind of private conversation. Just one more thing before we get into some other areas, but I'm curious about the title of your book, Openings Heaven's Doors, where the dying wants to teach us about where they may be going, and the idea that we have, and immediately around whatever happens after life, is informed in so many ways by things of our worldview, our religious pieces, etc. I was very, very excited and happy about your definition of spirituality. I loved what you said. You said spirituality is the cultivation of love. It's the knowledge that you have a purpose and the acceptance that ego is nothing, if not entirely irrelevant. So it's in your concept, spirituality is not a religious worldview that you've been trying to bring there. So I don't know if you have a comment about that, but
well, I mean, the most sort of the simplest and most straightforward comment about that is that my American publisher insisted I put heaven in the title because then they could get the book into Target and Walmart. So, I mean, that literally is how they think about these things, right? So that has ever been the frustration of my career as a journalist, that you get put into boxes for marketing purposes. So it wasn't my own original title, and not because I dispute that there's a heaven or not, but just because it is, by definition, an ecumenical book. It's not about a particular religious worldview or a particular conception of the afterlife. Rather, what I wanted to do was I wanted to follow the beats in my sister's dying and why she became progressively more peaceful and serene, even elated, and why she was seeing things at the end of her bed and seeing things on the ceiling that she was interacting with in this really beautiful way. And so I went and interviewed people who'd had near-death experiences who could articulate for me what she may have been feeling, because at that point she was beyond language. And so their descriptions of a world beyond this world is really the one that I consider to be evidence-based, and it's not actually a mirror of any specific religion.
And I appreciate that very much, and I really, I think that's an important piece for us to begin this conversation with. It really is a book for everyone, and I really would encourage that.
Yeah, I'm sitting here struggling because I always have 16 questions running through my head at once. But we've brought up a lot of themes for me, because reading the book and knowing that you're a journalist and a writer and an author, I was always drawn to the points where you were talking about language, and I was sort of walking through the book and looking at language and communication. And there's a few places where you talk about, death has been secularized and medicalized and sort of removed from this sacred context, you said. And so we've managed to lose our language and our ritual around the spiritual experience of death, even as we've managed to increase the likelihood of hearing back from the near dead about their experiences. And as a writer, as a person who has made their career with language, what was that experience like to be talking to people that had experiences that were really difficult to put into language?
Well, I guess it really caught my attention as somebody who pays attention to words. What is called the ineffability, the indescribability of certain spiritual experiences is a really, really important point to emphasize, because science has so many very precise terms around everything that it measures and that it talks about. And the spiritual is at a loss, in a way, to combat scientific explanations, precisely because it's so indescribable what you experience. And if you talk to people who've had really deep NDEs, for instance, they will universally talk about how that experience is more real than this experience here in this world. That was to them, it's like, here we are as paper cutout dolls. That's actually what Carl Jung said after he had a near-death experience. Everything becomes two-dimensional and black and white. That world, whatever that world is, that dimension is so much more real. And yet, ironically, that hyper-reality has absolutely no valence to a scientist who says, well, what's the objective reality of it? Right. And so it's, we need to be able to develop some kind of consensus language around some of this stuff so that other people can kind of understand what you mean. Just like when you describe that it tastes like a cucumber, other people know what you mean, even though you couldn't describe what a cucumber tastes like to an alien who'd never had, like, it's impossible. Well, it tastes like a cucumber, it's a cucumber taste. And so that, I think, is a really important part right now, especially in hospice and palliative care, is if we could start to try to come up with some common language around some of these experiences, rather than simply like try to hush them, turn them on, put them under the rug, say, you're imagining things, it's drugs, you're irrational. No, these things happen, and people need to be able to figure out how to commonly discuss them.
To describe the indescribable. And it was really stark at the start when you were telling the story of your sister's journey, when it went from sort of the oncology side of things, where you were battling cancer and, they were bringing in the heavy artillery, you said, to the language of when she moved into a hospice and the light was shining through her and everything was comfortable. And there was this stark, very clear change in the descriptions and the descriptors that are used in terms of her and her experiences. As you said, she became more peaceful as she got closer.
Yeah, and the dying, at least according to the various people I've interviewed and talked to in the palliative care community, begin to use sort of very terse and often sort of poetic language in the 72 hours before they die. Not poetic in the sense of flowery, but in the sense of distilled. And they will often talk about that they need to go somewhere. They want to go home, or they want to go shopping, or they want to go to sleep. And they're intimating a desire, or even, I think, a readiness. They're signaling a readiness to engage in a transition. But because family members aren't familiar with that kind of, what the meaning of that language is, they get really distressed. Because I remember my uncle, for instance, when my aunt was dying, she kept saying, I want to go home. And he was like, oh, but I can't take you home. You have to stay here. But that's not, it wasn't what she meant. What she meant, I'm ready to leave this plane of existence, so to speak. And I don't think that you can correct me because you guys have worked in this area, but I don't think they're being euphemistic. Like, I don't think that they're trying to soften the blow, because they're beyond that in terms of what their consciousness is capable of manipulating in itself, because they're dying. So I think they really are filtering their dying moments through this idea of translocation, of migrating to a different space, which is fascinating.
I had that exact experience just earlier this week with a family, and their loved one had told them, I've got to go. Where's the ticket? Like, they were looking for the ticket to go. And they understood the language, thankfully, but I just sort of reassured them, that is very common, that toward the end of life, people will have that sense of they've got a schedule to keep, they've got to catch that train, or there's a plane waiting. So they talk about runways and things like that to leave. And I think you're probably right in terms of it's not like they're being funny or jokey or euphemistic. They are, I think, preparing everybody, themselves and the people that they're with, for the fact that their train is about to leave the station, and they know it.
And how do they know it?
Yeah. And that's the piece that's you describe. We don't have language around that, or even understanding, but that doesn't mean it's not true. And I think those are the pieces where, again, I think this conversation is important, because I know that there are a lot of families out there who have experienced that, but they don't know where to talk about it, and they're left with, well, I must have been crazy, or it was a hallucination. But you're absolutely right. I mean, my own father, the same thing. I remember clearly. He was in Emerge, and we got called up at 4 a.m, and my first work experience was in respiratory technology. So he was on oxygen, and he hated that oxygen mask on him. So he kept pulling it off, and I kept putting it on, because that's what sons do. And finally, he ripped it off, and he looked at me, and he said, "No, I just want to go home." And there it was again. He died about 5 minutes later. But home wasn't. I don't know what he meant by that. All I know was it wasn't. It was a place other than here, and he had a sense of that. So I think it's important that people hear that, so that they recognize, okay, this is as normative in a human experience. It can be. Not everybody has it, but it's okay. It's not, doesn't make me weird or strange.
No, and it if you can kind of get your head around it, it facilitates your graceful support of the person dying. So that you're not wasting tension and time arguing with them about something that you don't necessarily interpret correctly. And the other thing, there's a really interesting research that was done in the early 1970s, where some of these two social psychologists were looking at what people did in the time leading up to the very end of their lives, and comparing India and America. And in both cases, what they found, because they were researching in hospitals, that even people who were in the hospitals for reasons that weren't intended to be terminal, they were there because they had whatever, like gout or a broken leg, but for some reason there was a complication or something, they started to talk in that language too, even though the doctors didn't anticipate that they were going to die. And so, but before they died, they would start speaking in terms of journey and travel and so on. So there is some kind of mind-body connection, I think, that's there in all of us. Your body's alerting your mind, or there's a spiritual wellspring of knowledge that's coming to you. I don't know. There's no way to know, but we have to observe it, and we have to respect it and not fight it.
Yeah.
And it is okay not to know. I think mystery is a great gift in this life. And as we come to death, mystery is wonderful. You do make a distinguishing between near-death awareness and near-death experience. Maybe you could help us with that piece that you've discovered.
Yeah, so the idea of near-death experience, that was first formulated by the psychiatrist Raymond Moody, I think in the early 70s. And what he meant by that was people who were very close to death. They may be even temporarily without a pulse or without breath, who come back and report these very profound experiences of, leaving their bodies, encountering light that's not just light, but also feels like love and also feels like intelligence. It's like a sentient light that envelops them, and various components to it that are quite similar across cultures. Nearing death awareness is a less well-known phenomenon, which hospice nurses coined the phrase for. And that has to do with these things we're talking about, which is becoming aware that you're close to death. So whether it's the language of journey that we're talking about, whether it's beginning to see relatives at the end of your bed, which is pretty common. They did a study at Hospice Buffalo, for instance, a couple of years ago, where they found that 88% of their dying patients had dreams and visions at the end of life in the last 48 hours. Now, that's a Catholic population that Hospice Buffalo is serving, so they want to expand that research and see if they can compare it to, people with different religious backgrounds. But in the meantime, what they are finding is that it's extremely common for people to see the deceased as if they're there beckoning them to join them on the other side, whatever the other side is. So those are some aspects of nearing death awareness, which is, a completely different phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. All these experiences sort of support the idea of mind or spirit beyond body, right? And is that what we're, I don't know if that's what we're tuning into maybe at times of death and nearing death, is that we're tuning more into that and maybe less the ego in the sense of the body, that I'm a person here on this earth as opposed to I'm a person maybe someplace else.
You get that feeling. I certainly had that feeling with my sister because she was in hospice for 10 days. So I had a good amount of time to hover around her and really observe her. Not that at the time that's what I was thinking about, but I mean, I was with her continuously until she died. So I saw these really subtle changes in her. And later, after I talked to various people who work in these fields, and as well as researchers on non-local consciousness, on consciousness that can go beyond the biological body, you get some really interesting insights from some people who really thought about it deeply. And one of them, I was talking to this woman who is a hospice worker, but her background is in what do you call it? It's like a somatic body work, right? So she pays a lot of attention to the physical body and its relationship to the mind. And what she was telling me, which I'd never heard this, and it was fascinating to me, was that at the end of the life, the spirit is trying to disentangle itself from the physical body, but it's not like an easy disentanglement. So she said you can compare it to somebody who's practicing diving off of a diving board, and they take 3 jumps in and out, not jumps, but squats on the board before they get the courage to have enough bounce in the board to leave it. So when you're watching somebody who's dying and they're suddenly lucid for a little while, and then they go unconscious, and they suddenly seem to be expanded beyond their physical selves because they're seeing people at the end of their bed, and then they're talking to you normally. She sees that as being their non-local consciousness moving in and out of their physical body until it finally can extract itself and go, which I thought was a really interesting frame for what I've seen.
It's almost like they're practicing trying to leave the body and move into this next level of consciousness, if you will, or
yeah. And every time they have that upward motion, so to speak, in the practice, they get a little glimpse of that wider world in which. So probably the best example of what that might be, or rather, well, let me rephrase that. Maybe the best illustration of what she was trying to explain is this phenomenon called terminal lucidity. So, I mean, this is becoming widely accepted now. The National Institute of Health in the United States is putting a lot of funding into researching terminal lucidity. and I think some of your listeners will be familiar with this, which is that you can have your loved one be completely comatose, completely unconscious. They can have advanced Alzheimer's. They can have advanced brain disease that's completely impeded their ability to think straight. And then all of a sudden, relatively soon before they die, maybe up to 72 hours before they die, they come to clear consciousness for no physically apparent reason. My mother did this last January. For anywhere up to an hour or less, could be 10 minutes. And that's called terminal lucidity. And there's no physiological explanation for how that's possible. Except, if you think in terms of they're gaining their mind's release from their body and beginning to be able to be clear. It's like Occam's razor. What's the simplest explanation?
Yeah, we often call that the surge or the last moment of contact, in a way that you're right. They become totally lucid. Even people with dementia have those moments where they have a conversation and it's just that last hurrah, it seems. And that can be great comfort for the family. Although at some times I've also seen it to where families immediately jump to, oh, they're getting better.
I was just going to
right?
say,
So that
yeah.
they don't, and then when they go back, it's like this devastation. But they actually, that's how dramatic that can be in that moment.
Yeah, that's right. It's very dramatic. And I remember the first time I witnessed it was way back when, in 2001, when a very dear friend was dying of brain cancer, and exactly that. We thought her final bout of whole brain radiation had worked, because all of a sudden she was at the dinner table and she was complaining about Andrew Coyne on the radio, and she was, just being her normal self, totally articulate, whereas before she'd been slurring from the impact of the brain tumor. And we all thought, oh my God, this is so great. The whole brain radiation has done its trick. And she was dead the next day. And then we requested to see the scans, the most recent scans they'd done of her brain. And in fact, the lesions had grown, not shrunk. And that was way before I got into this research, so I didn't know what to make of that. But now I look back and I think that's a classic example of terminal lucidity.
Very much.
Why do you think it's, or what's your take on why it's so difficult sometimes for us to talk about this, to share our stories? And what I'm thinking of there, Patricia, is the number of clients that will come to me and they're almost kind of sheepish in, I want to tell you something. I don't know what you're going to think of it, but I want to share it. And then they share these stories. And I'm talking about even experiences they've had around a near-death experience, or just what they've witnessed in somebody else. But there's this secrecy, there's this cloak of secrecy, of silence around it. And I mean, obviously that's around judgment, we know. But yet, and as your book talks about it, so many of us are having these experiences, and yet there seems to be a conspiracy of silence around it.
I think that we're on the edge of that beginning to shift. But I think we just survived a long period of what one scholar has called lectures from the men in black frocks and the men in white coats about what is possible and what is real. Mm-hmm. And so the church is just as responsible for policing this stuff, right, as the scientific establishment, because they don't want to lose control over their access to your access to God. So it's been a really long time of people confining it to folklore, common conversations amongst themselves, and that's beginning to crumble. You're beginning to see more and more people say, you know what? This is real. This happened. I don't care if you think I'm an idiot. Or I guess it's the degree to which we privilege the so-called rational in our society, mm-hmm. right? So it's like the elite place to be is the rocket scientist, and everybody else is just kind of a Dumbo, like I was watching a stand-up comedian the other night who generally I find really funny. But then, of course, he's making this joke about the delusions people have around death and dying, ha ha. And you realize that like it's a legitimate thing. It's the last taboo. It's the last thing that you're allowed to make fun of. Sorry, it's the last thing that's not a taboo. Right? And so we have a lot of work to do to push back against that, I think, on behalf of everyone whose lives have actually been profoundly moved by, I mean, that's the irony too, right? Is that these are the most moving experiences you have in your entire life. And they're the ones that somebody wants to take away and stomp on.
I do wonder, and I don't know if this is too big of a reach, but I do wonder if that's, some of the accounts I'm reading about the work with psychedelics and the experiences that people are having it sounds like it's very similar. This idea of it's a different level of consciousness that they're leaving kind of behind during the psychedelic experience, this, the trappings of our conditioning, and we're able to move beyond it.
Yeah, I think I was at a conference. I was on a panel, and it was a combination of people from NYU and Johns Hopkins who had been experimenting with giving psilocybin, magic mushrooms, to people in the early stages of a cancer diagnosis to help them with their death anxiety, and comparing what they experienced with what we know people at the end of life and near-death experiences have, to see if they were kind of getting what you're saying, like, were there similarities in these things. And one of the things that the kind of increasing permissibility of using MDMA and psilocybin and ayahuasca and so on back in therapy, even if it's just at the so-called clinical trial or experimental stage right now, is an example of that softening of the prejudice against the irrational.
Yeah.
And so that's a really good sign, I think.
I always go back to my favorite, the play, The Search for Signs of Intelligent Life in the Universe, Jane Wagner. And she has a line in there that says, what is reality anyway? Nothing but a collective hunch. And that sense that there is a mystery, and lots of people don't want there to be a mystery. They want everything to be rationally explained and understandable. I don't know if that's for control reasons, to make people feel safe. But we are in a place where in this environment, these experiences, we don't have the language and we don't have the experiences. But I think, people hearing this, I often hear someone who's maybe had an experience like your sister had when your dad died, a visitation of someone who's just died, and they find it the next day that they died that through the night. They have that experience, or they feel a touch, like your sister on the back of her head or in a hand, or someone will roll over and reach for their spouse who's just died in the other bit because they felt that they were there. That they do feel like maybe they're losing touch with reality, that their mind is slipping. I don't know how many times people have said to you guys, I feel like, am I going crazy? And it's like, no, you're not going crazy. In fact, many, 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 many people have these experiences. So I'm hoping that people are listening can find comfort in the fact that they're really not alone. It's just we don't talk about it. And if you're saying maybe we are on the cusp of it becoming more part of the conversation that we have, but lots and lots of people having very, very similar experiences, that there's something there.
I think I caught some of your frustration in that very piece about butting up against that other mindset. You have a line there where you say, when you're a journalist trying to sort through all this, your hands just go up in the air. And I get this sense that when you confront people who in the rational worldview have no room for the reality that you experience, and that's what is reality there. So I'm sure even in your experiences in researching this, there were moments when you felt that you weren't heard or valued in what point you were bringing forward to this conversation.
Yeah, well, originally, like when I was doing the reporting and research on it, I almost didn't tell some of my friends what I was working on, because I didn't want flack from them. Oh, Patricia's being woo-woo, But the funny thing is, and I really braced for it when the book came out, but the thing that was so surprising was the number of people who didn't have that reaction. I was getting Facebook messages from members of parliament and like children's doctors and professors and, all of them saying, I've never told anyone this, but, and then feeling like I'd given them permission to actually voice what they'd experienced. And around this question of it being kind of how you frame it, there was this one researcher who was looking at imaginary friends in childhood. And he was trying to do a cross-cultural research. So he went over to Kenya and he was working with an interpreter. And he kept going around to try to find children in Kenya who wanted to talk about their imaginary friends. And there weren't any. And he was really confounded because it was so common in North America. And he said to the interpreter, what's going on? Like, why don't they? And he said, because you're asking them if they're imaginary.
Yeah.
So they don't have imaginary friends. They have spirits and ancestors. So a lot of it is around the framing.
Back to language.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Because like you say, what is infinite and what is not? How do we know what is infinite and what is not? What do we trust, our eyes or our instincts, our guidebooks or our guts, right? I've got some pretty rational friends, and we have some crackerjack conversations about this very thing, about that there's still mystery, that it's still out there. What I'm curious, if you think back, did the writing and the researching of this book change you in any way, and how you saw the world?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely changed the way I saw the world. I lost some of my ego, absolutely, which isn't very good for my wallet. But I'm, way less self-promotional than maybe I should be to pay for my new propane wood stove. But I really, and I saw it happening. My ego just started to disintegrate. Because I just realized that we were part of something far greater, this just greater collective consciousness, this greater collective whole. And maybe I had to get there through, as a journalist, through looking at the evidence instead of, trying to go to church or, talk to a Hindu guru or a Buddhist. I couldn't get there that way. I had always had a lot of respect for mystery. I just intuitively thought the world was going to always be more complicated than we like to think. But I couldn't have got there in a different way than I did, which was from these powerful, powerful firsthand accounts of a world that was different than what we supposed. And it shaped me in a different way, in the sense of not only did I lose some of my ego, but I also I'm not afraid of death. My experience of losing my mother this past year, who I was really, really close to, it was less existentially traumatic than losing my father and my sister 15 years ago. So I think my mother's out there still. And we had a really extraordinary experience in regard to that when she was dying in the hospital in Ottawa. And we had to make the decision to take her off a ventilator. She had pulmonary fibrosis. And my elder sister was just really torn apart by the ethics of, how do we decide when to do this? So she was outside of the hospital and she was just walking blindly around on the sidewalk, and she kind of went into prayer and she said, "What do I do?" And for the first time in 15 years, the voice of my sister who had died came into her head clear as a bell and said, "Anne, go back. We're waiting for her."
Oh.
And it was the first time, you hear about people seeing people who are deceased as they're dying at the end of their bed, but to hear it from the other perspective of the deceased waiting for them,
Mm-hmm.
and reassuring my sister, it's okay, you can let her go because we're waiting.
Mm-hmm.
That was just mind blowing.
Wow.
And you gave, thank you for that. You gave it, there was an example, and I'm not sure where in the book, where a person was describing receiving a message, and she said, it was like I I'm paraphrasing, walking through a hallway and a loudspeaker came on. And I've heard that from people before. And I've actually had that experience myself. And I remember telling David this experience where I said, I knew it wasn't my own thought. I knew what I heard came from outside of me, that I heard this message. And it sounds like, and so when I read in your book that description of, it was like I was walking down a hallway and somebody put a loudspeaker on and said, like, there's the message. And I hear this from people. I've heard that and I've experienced it myself.
That must be so surprising. I mean, I can't imagine what that would be like.
To just receive something like that.
And totally unexpectedly, right?
Yes, and to know that it's true. And I experienced it when I was very, very ill in cancer treatment myself. And I heard it from my father. And I remember sharing it with David in our next conversation. And me just saying to David, like, I know it's there. I know that did not come from my own thought process. That from what I heard from him. And so there was something about reading that in the book. And I've heard this from my own clients. And I went, yes. So there's an example of an experience where many of us are getting to have. And it's hard to describe it and it's hard to share it.
Well, especially with that kind of thing, it's hard to share because then a psychiatrist will equate it with a psychotic, with the voices that a schizophrenic hears or whatever.
And then comes the questions of, am I crazy? Does that sound crazy? I don't know if you'll believe it. I feel like I need to qualify this. Yeah.
There's a great, it was a documentary into a DVD that I used to use in my course called Death Makes Life Possible. And it's the exploring of all of this. But the point of the whole documentary was, and this is what all of us working in this field have come to believe, is that as we explore death and we come to explore the experiences of people around death, it changes life for us. It helps us live better. And so what you described about how has it affected you, I think for all of us who work in this, it has changed us. But it doesn't have to be limited to just people working in it. If we as a culture society would be more open to talking about it and learning about, thinking about it, it would really help us live differently and I believe live much better.
That's a really good point.
I don't, I'm very careful, as we all are. It's not my experiences around that doesn't mean that I need other people to have those experiences either. That's really important. But there have been occasions, and one of the pieces that I've come to embrace in my own life, and it's for me, I'm not suggesting this, but I've come to, in working with this, hearing so many of these stories, Patricia, and then your book has just kind of affirmed that, on a personal level, I've come to believe nobody dies alone. And that is such a comfort. And there have been moments in situations with families where where I could voice that without it coming across as as prescriptive. And it's a comfort. And I think that there's things that we could, even if we don't understand, we can allow them to change us, and that's not, and I think you mentioned that I know you do in your book, where it's not simply another mechanism to try to downplay the terror of dying. We're not doing this to get out of scare tactics. This is real, that we can embrace, that help us not only live better but live right up until death in a way that allows us to do that differently than we might. So I think it has to change us if we can allow that. But as I say, I think that can be the experience of anyone.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point, because I agree. And then that makes you wonder, like, so in the cultures where people are more comfortable with death and also more connected to the idea that death can have a spiritual dimension, is there less materialism and less ego and less, what could you point to as an example and say, we could be more like this group of people? I don't know. I'd have to think about that. But I agree with you that it is so transformative. And it's so important for families to think in those, not only in terms of what you're saying about people don't subjectively experience themselves necessarily as dying alone, which is really important. But also, based on the interviews I've done anyway with people that have had NDEs, people don't necessarily experience the physical trauma and pain of, for instance, a violent death the way we think they do, because often they've already gone out of body, right? And, whether you think of that as just a kind of psychological defense mechanism or an actual, ascent into a different realm, you can choose either. But the reality is the same, which is they don't necessarily suffer as much as we worry about them suffering.
Which is where we get trapped, the bereaved get trapped.
Yeah.
In that, that's its own kind of torture for the bereaved, is believing that they died this incredibly painful death.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. I always think, and you guys have more experience this by far, of course, than I do, but that there are two elements to grief that I've discovered that I have to process. One is the loss, but the other is the horror. Mm-hmm. That piece around the witnessing of the death that feels horrifying. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't mean to use that word like a horror movie, but do you know what I mean?
I do. And I actually find, even back to language, there are times I've handed that word to people and say, is it horror? And they'll go, yes, that is.
Really?
And there's been even relief or it's horror and terror sometimes, where because it's hard to describe, and having a word sometimes to label, that was my experience, can be helpful, can be regulating for them. Yeah. So I agree.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Wow, that's good to know.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's these are really good points. I'm there's two things that pop to my mind. There's that sense of being out of body. And then there's that sense of, and then people might have had this if they haven't had the out of body experience, where you're in a situation and time changes. It slows down. Things start to seem like they're moving in slow motion. I've read about this, and I had this experience one time. My brother and I, when we were much younger, were driving to Kingston, along the 401, and someone cut us off. And we went sort of spinning down the highway because we hit the ditch, and we spun, and we ended up sort of perpendicular to the road. And I turned to my left, where I was the passenger, and I said to my brother, "Good driving, Tare." And then I looked to my right, and there's a transport truck coming right at me. I said, "I hope this guy can stop." And I was as calm, and the whole thing was in slow motion, and my "Good driving, Terry. I hope this guy can stop." And there was like the sense that we were literally this calm. There was a peace inside the car. Now the truck got stopped, and we finally, the car stalled out, and we got it going again and got off the highway. But it was the strangest thing, where time stopped being as we experience it normally, right? We went into a different sort of sense of time, and it all slowed down. And that then sort of shakes our foundations of our sense of what's real.
Yeah.
What do I know is real every day, so that when I have a mystical or a mysterious experience, can I trust it?
Yeah.
There's that sense of, did that really happen? Did time really slow down there? Or was that just what happened there? And maybe there's a scientific explanation for it or not, but it was certainly experienced. And I think that's one of the things we do, is we sometimes diminish that experience immediately because it doesn't fit with our sense of reality.
Yeah, and that question, can I trust it, is really important. And also, when you don't have language around something that happens to you, it's like writing on water, and the experience itself will kind of dissipate because you can't imprint it with the language. You can't label it. You can't say this thing. And there's actually research on this that shows that people are more likely to forget certain kinds of spiritual experiences if they don't know how to label them or explain them. They just kind of let them go cognitively because they can't hold on to them. So that's another reason why the language has really got, we have work to do.
Mm-hmm. And which is why people so often have that sense of, am I feeling crazy? Am I losing touch? Am I losing my grip? Because what they're experiencing doesn't match their sense of what is real.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I do want to say, we keep referencing your book. The book is incredibly expansive in its research. I want to ask, how long did it take you to do the research? I mean, there's a lot of interviews, reading of research. connecting with researchers. How long did it take you?
I think I think I started it in 2009, and I handed in the manuscript in 2013. So 4 years. Took me 4 years. Some of which that time I was working full time, so I couldn't really concentrate on it as much. So yeah, but yeah, took about 4 years.
Where has this book, and we've already touched on how it changed you, where has it taken you from here? Because this book was published in 2014. So where has the book, where has life taken you in terms of this work? We alluded to some of it in the opening.
Well, after I wrote that book, I got a grant from the Donner Canadian Foundation to do some research into those. We talk about grief hallucinations, or the experience of sensing a presence after someone has died, or seeing somebody after, or hearing a voice after they've died. But what I wanted to look at after that was the experience where that was the way that you found out the person had died. Because then all of the arguments about it being wishful psychosis and you're conjuring up a hallucination because you miss them so much and so on goes out the window, because it's actually the first way that you find out that they've died. And of course, why did I want to look at that? Because it turned out to be pretty common. And you kept hearing from people saying, I was driving along the road and all of a sudden out my front window, I saw, as if in a cameo pendant, the face of my uncle on the highway. And I thought that was so bizarre. And then, he goes home and his uncle has died. So I got really interested in that. And I spent about 1.5 years doing research on that. And the couple of things that came out of that were really interesting. One was that if you look at all the studies that have been done on this, which are not huge numbers because, of course, who can get funding for it? But you go back to the late 19th century, and then in Switzerland and in Brazil and in France, there have been various studies over the years of this experience of realizing someone close to you has died by dint of a dream or a hallucination or hearing their voice or something like that. And you cross-reference all of these studies, and one of the things that pops out in terms of the pattern is that you're most likely to hear in this fashion from an older male relative. So to the contrary of what you would expect with a grief hallucination, which would be that it was your deceased child who is the one you're trying to conjure up, it's actually somehow related to the matrix of patriarchy, maybe? Or
you just took the word. I was like, so the patriarchy continues.
Yeah. Isn't that strange?
Yes.
And I mentioned this actually one day to a woman who's a practitioner of Chinese medicine. And she's the only one who said to me, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And I'm like, what do you mean that makes sense? And she said, because the patriarch is the holder of the energetic matrix in the family. Everyone's attuned to the patriarch. So when he dies, let's go of the energetic web. Everybody feels it. So that's one explanation. But it just was an interesting piece that popped out of all the patterns of in this work. But the other thing that you realize after looking at all of this stuff is A, that it's really common, and B, that it tells you that the most likely ghost, quote unquote, that any human being is going to see is someone who loves them and who is telling them they're okay. Mm-hmm. And compare that to our cultural understanding of a ghost.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing.
Yes.
You say the book is it's richly researched, but incredibly readable, and accessible, which was quite a feat to do. Because you think, I'm going to get bogged down in research, but you make it incredibly readable. Was that difficult? Because we're talking about language and losing our language. We're talking about, here's your book, Opening Heaven's Door. And it's full of research and full of things that we struggle to find the words for, and yet you made a very readable document.
Well, that's why I went and got a master's degree in journalism at Columbia.
Well, you did well then.
Takes training.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 But it's narrative, right? It's
Yeah.
that, and the best way to convey things is through the narrative of people's lives.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the book.
Yeah.
I
And-
think it's the combination of research through narrative
Yeah.
speaking.
And I think I wanted the listeners to know that even though it's richly steeped in research, that if they go out and pick up a copy, they're going to be able to read it. It isn't going to
Yeah.
be something that they don't find accessible, right?
Exactly.
So it's
Yeah.
very accessible.
And I was thinking about, for the way I read it, of course, was in this. Yep. Yeah. Well, that makes sense. Or yes, I agree with that. Or that makes sense with what I know and what my clients have taught me and what I've experienced myself. So there's those of us who will feel very affirming and validating, and for those who are more curious or more maybe have some different kinds of views about it, then it's like there's a lot of information there just to receive and to percolate and chew on. For me, it didn't feel that way because this all feels very congruent for me. But for those who it may not be, it's like, okay, so here's a lot of information that's very narrative for you to receive and just allow that just to kind of metabolize within you.
Again, I think as a culture, I think we're getting better. I hope we are. I hope that's something you've experienced as well. I think part of that has been the whole deinstitutionalizing of death. We turned over death to the professionals and to institutionalize, and as we hopefully find, and that's the gift of hospice work, and I think of more people who are wanting to experience death in a home, in their home, if we can as a society work towards making that more possible, I think we will hear more of these stories. There will be more of that connection, and I love the way you raise the whole Celtic spirituality, and I think that's so important, that can teach us the value of those experiences. But when we suddenly, back in the early century, we let the professionals deal with death, we lost so much of our learning around that hopefully we will see coming back. So again, I think the book is incredibly relevant. I appreciated it in so many ways, Patricia.
Thank you.
And I think it's a great discussion starter. I think it just allows people the opportunity to do that. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for
And
bringing
thanks
this
for being
book
here
to us
today.
Yeah.
No, my pleasure.
Yeah. Just in a way of closing, I do want to ask you, Patricia, is there anything we haven't covered that you think is important that we do mention, or that we would be not kind of respecting all that you've brought us here?
I can't think of anything. What I'm trying to work on right now, I'm just in the middle of procrastinating on a book proposal. But I want to do a companion book for this on extraordinary grief. So the flip side, so going from nearing death awareness stuff to talking about some of these other things that we're talking about in terms of grief and but then really taking, if you can, like a deeper dive into, so for example, birds, people grieving people and birds, but then what do we know about that, like culturally and historically, like what's going on there? Why bird?
So common,
right?
Birds, so common.
Big time.
Dimes.
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 I'm finding dimes.
Yeah, but
And that's like, I laugh at that. I've heard so many dime stories.
Oh yeah.
A dime a dozen?
Yeah, people find dimes in places that dimes shouldn't be.
Yeah.
I had one person say
Experience.
they actually heard the dime hit the kitchen table. They were in the living room. They heard the sound of something hitting the kitchen table. They went out, and there was a dime on the floor in the middle of the kitchen table, or in the middle of the kitchen floor.
So that's called a port, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So some of these, like, people know what they are, but they don't know what they're called. They don't know how common they are. So I'm thinking of doing this companion book that's sort of looking at some of those pieces, in the same way, which is like, is is it true in Africa? Is it true in Finland? Which how common are these things, and what are they? And synchronicities, right? Like the synchronicities around death are crazy, crazy.
So lots to talk about. Lots to explore.
So do you think that's a good, should I do that?
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
And I even think of just people locally here who would be, how many stories, in probably most of my bereavement sessions at some point, for most people, stories like that are coming up.
Yeah.
And I invite them and I ask about them because I want people to feel like when they're with me, that it is a safe and welcoming place to share those stories, to share those experiences, because they do often bring them comfort, always bring them comfort, and they need to be shared and feel like they can do that. So please, if you get around to writing that book proposal and then the book, please come back and share that with us.
Yes,
been
I'd love
really, I know we say this at the end of most of the times of our topics, but I really feel like this was one that could go on for several more hours. It's fascinating. Yeah. And I think it just feels so deeply relevant to the work that we do and the things that our clients share and have taught us through the years. So thank you so much for being here today.
Birds, dimes, and dragonflies. I'd be interested to see if you find about anything about dragonflies.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll look into it.
Absolutely, but thank you so much.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough. Music is by Paradise Garage, and technical support provided by Sean and Jonah Heichert. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studios. You can find more episodes of What Now for free on most major podcast platforms, including Spotify, CastBox, Apple Podcasts, and Overcast. If you want to support us, please follow and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts, and tell your friends. It does make a difference.